without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rami Khouri.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you all for coming out. I'm glad to see everybody smiling in Boston. I know it's because of the baseball situation, and I wish you luck. My wife is ecstatic, and we watch every single game of these playoffs. She's a Red Sox fan, and one of the things that she developed from our coming and going here to Harvard and other places in Boston that we've been affiliated with, and it's a great pleasure to be here again, just this time for about a month. But there's an awful lot going on in the Middle East, and I think it's useful once in a while to kind of pause and step back from the day-to-day events and try to assess, if we can, in some meaningful way, what is actually happening, what has been achieved, what is a passing phenomenon, what may be lasting and meaningful, and what is yet to come. The pace, the nature, and the intensity of the changes that have been taking place in the Arab world primarily. Israel, Turkey, Iran have their own dynamics, and there's amazing things going on there, but I'm just talking about the Arab world, and the pace, the intensity, and the dynamism, the consequences of what's happening in the Arab world is unprecedented. Not just in the Arab world, I think perhaps in human history. Rarely have we seen an entire region undergo such momentous changes leading to such historic transformations with unknown consequences across the entire region, and primarily driven by the will of its own citizenries. This is quite unprecedented. The process that started on December 17, 2010 in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia, when Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire as both a protest of his denied citizenship, but also an affirmation of his humanity, that he is not a powerless person. He can make a statement, even if it is a grotesque one and suicidal. The process that was sparked by Mohamed Bouazizi's gesture has touched every Arab country, without exception, to some degree, because the fundamental underlying grievances that drove him to do what he did drove tens of millions of other people around the region to go out into the streets to demand change, and drove several 100 million Arabs to watch this intensely every night on television, on Jazeera and other places. That process is one that shows us that the fundamental grievances are common across the Arab world. There isn't a single Arab country that can say that it is immune from the basic grievances that have driven these changes and that pushed Bouazizi, and by the way, 65 other people self-immolated in the couple of months around when Bouazizi did. Half of them died, half of them didn't die. And there's been some fantastic research that's been done by Hernando de Soto in Peru and his institute. They interviewed all the survivors who died in about 7 different Arab countries, and they found some really compelling research results from why these people set themselves on fire. What is it that, what was the problem? And this fundamental problem that he found, and that I think we can see very clearly across the region, is individual men and women in the Arab world felt that they had neither their rights as citizens nor the capacity to exercise their full faculties as human beings. And they were stopped from doing this by their own governments. Israeli occupations and colonization and American invasions and British subterfuge and Iranian and Russian and other machinations in the region are a big problem, but the biggest problem for people in the Arab world was their denial of their citizenship rights and their fundamental humanity by their own governments and by their own power elites. And that's why this citizen revolt that started on December 17, 2010 spread so quickly and captured the intense attention of so many people all across the Arab world, because 200 or 300 million other Arabs instinctively understood what bothered Bouazizi, because they shared those grievances. They knew exactly what bothered him, and that's why this process has spread. So we're almost 3 years later. In a couple of months it'll be 3 years that this has been going on, and there's been enormous change across the region in many different forms, including NATO wars and civil wars and terrorism spreading and Islamist militants and democracy transitions and constitution writing and tribal reassertion and all kinds of things have been happening. So I think it's useful to try to step back a little bit and perhaps sort out, if we can, what is meaningful and lasting and what is just a passing phenomenon. I think the balance sheet is complex, very mixed, and constantly changing. So we're trying to hit a moving target here, but I think it's worth trying to do that every once in a while, because it'll help us understand maybe what is to come, and particularly for the people in the region, it'll help us understand, well, where should we be pushing harder? Where should activists and men and women of goodwill work harder to try to achieve the promise of these rebellions and revolutions that are still largely unfulfilled? We see much better now the full dimensions of the many different processes and dynamics that are underway. And these dynamics and processes, whether it's war or democracy or civil society activism, accountability, legitimacy, tribal reassertion, regionalization, the many, many things that are going on across the region, they are both sequential and simultaneous. And this is what makes them so complex. And what is clear now, especially in a place like Syria, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, even Egypt and Tunis, which are in fact the easiest ones, I think. But what is clear now is that what these people in the Arab countries are trying to do is compress into a period of a few years processes of state building that most countries in the world required a couple of centuries to do. And what you have, if you look at a place like, if you look at Libya, if you look at Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, any of them at their different stages, they're simultaneously involved in a revolutionary war and a war for independence to get rid of the forces that dominate them, who are internal but deeply linked to external forces. So you have it's an independence war. It's also a civil war because you have these intense domestic battles going on. It's also a process of constitution writing, which is happening at the same time as the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. It's also a process of struggle for civil rights, women's rights, minority rights. It's also a process of trying to affirm in a consensual manner the values of the nation, of the state, to come up with a package that the vast majority of the citizens of each country agree represents their value system. That to be a Tunisian means A, B, C, D. To be a Moroccan means this. The struggle for values, for consensual national values. And this is a process that's still going on here in the United States. When you look at gay people or immigrants or voting registration cards in different places, this is a struggle you're still dealing with here 200 and, what are we now, 235, 40 years after independence. So this is a never-ending process. So the critical thing to keep in mind at the beginning of this analysis is that not only are the Arab people trying to compress into 4 or 5 years processes that took 2 centuries in most other democratic countries, but they're also trying to do this at a time of intense economic stress, in some cases existentially threatening environmental problems, and deep penetration of their societies by regional and external forces. whether it's Iranians or Americans or Israelis or Saudis or Russians or French or whoever it may be. So trying to do all this at the same time is really totally out of the realm of the possible and the realistic. But the fact is, this is what is happening. In a place like Yemen or Tunis or Egypt. And it's happening because these Arab men and women have no other option. This is the hand that history dealt them. And they are trying as best they can to deal with these issues sequentially when that's possible. So you have a transitional government, you have a constitutional writing committee, then you have some kind of interim parliament, then you ratify the constitution, election, this, that, to try to do these things sequentially, which some people are doing to some extent, and in other cases, like in Egypt, it didn't work, so they get to try it again now. But in most cases, they don't have the luxury of doing these things sequentially. They're all happening simultaneously at the same time. So I would ask 4 basic questions. What has changed? What's new and what's not new? What has changed? What's significant? What is it that persists from the old days, the old ways? What remains to be achieved? And what are the consequences of everything that's going on? The consequences and our expectations. And keeping in mind that there are no answers to these questions that go across the whole Arab world. So in every situation, we're dealing with many different situations that we try to summarize as much as possible to see trends, to see broad trends that we can emerge. So what has changed, I think? Clearly, we now have citizens and citizenries in the Arab world. We have individual men and women, and we have entire citizenries that feel that they have rights, and more importantly, they feel that they have the capacity to bring those rights into activation, to achieve those rights. They feel a sense of empowerment that they never had before, and they are struggling to figure out how do you actually use that power. How do you turn your citizen rights into new systems of governance that are satisfactory and legitimate and lasting? So clearly we have these realities of citizens and a citizenry in every country, which will not go away. Once you develop this process, it's very hard historically to put that back in the bottle. How that citizenry manifests its capabilities remains to be clarified in many countries. The second thing I think we have is the birth of public political spheres in the Arab world. We never had public politics in the Arab countries in the last 60, 70 years. There was a brief fleeting moment in the 30s where you had a little bit of, in Syria and Iraq and Egypt, you had Lebanon, you had brief moments when you had real political pluralism, political parties, elections, but it was always under the tutelage of some foreign power or the tutelage of some local family that was appointed by a foreign power. So it never really took off. But now, these citizens who went out into the streets have created a public political sphere. A public political sphere means a public space where politics can happen, where people can contest power, where people can practice their citizenship. They can vote, they can create a civil society, non-governmental organization, they can open a newspaper, they can go on a march, they can beat each other up if they want, they can do all kinds of things. Most of them are non-violent, democratic, and political, but occasionally you'll have a violent episode here and there, as you still do in many countries around the world that have actually become stable democracies. But mostly you have people trying to figure out how do they affirm their citizenship in the public political sphere that they created. And what does this public political sphere allow them to do? So if you're a journalist today, are you allowed to criticize General Sisi on the state television? Probably not. But 6 months ago, you probably could have criticized the army. And so this is all still being worked out, and it keeps changing. So 8 months ago, the conditions of the public political sphere in terms of what is allowed to be done by citizens in Egypt are different than they are today, and they may change in 2 weeks. But that public political sphere has been created, and I believe also cannot go away. And that public political sphere is debating and defining the third, I think, significant new element, which is the heroic struggle by millions and millions of Arab people to shape a new social contract, to create a new deal and a new governance mechanism by which citizenship and authority actually come together in a legitimate and sustainable manner. And in a manner that is defined by the citizenry. In other words, the consent of the governed. A new social contract, not just for political governance, but also for social justice. Because one of the great drivers of these revolutions and uprisings has been and continues to be the demand for social justice. And this new social contract is based on the fourth new element, which I think is probably here to stay, which is a form of populist legitimacy anchored in the citizenry that is trying to create mechanisms of democratic pluralism anchored and protected by the rule of law. This is the most complicated thing that's going on now, people trying to create these new governance systems, and there's more progress in Tunis and Egypt than there is in other places. But this is happening to different degrees, and even in countries where they didn't have revolutions, in Morocco, in Jordan, in Oman, there's pressure from the citizenry to create new dimensions of citizen rights. In Oman, one of the most significant things that happened was 4 days ago, the government in Oman gave in to the demands of striking teachers. This wasn't on the news very much here, but it's one of the most significant things that's happened in the last few years on the scale of real political change. For striking teachers, government employees in Oman, which is a very top-heavy, paternalistic, happy little monarchy, a wonderful place, with zero citizenship rights, zero, but a wonderful country with a very generous ruler, Sultan Qaboos, who has built the place into something very impressive at the level of shopping malls and housing and schooling and education system and healthcare. Very impressive place, but zero citizenship rights. So teachers go on strike for weeks and weeks and weeks, demanding certain changes, and the government finally gives in. This is extraordinary affirmation that even in the oil-fueled small feudal monarchies, that citizen activism can bring about a greater degree of citizen rights, and this is leading to the creation of a public political sphere. And you see this in different ways all over the region. There's many, many examples of this. So they're not trying to create a democracy in Oman. They're just trying to get a little bit more rights for teachers, for civil society activists, for others. But this is just a striking example that even not only in the countries where revolutions happen, but also in other countries, we are seeing significant and historic things starting to happen. The ultimate goal is a democratic pluralism process under the rule of law. That's the ideal. And the fifth thing, which is needed to achieve this, is the writing of new constitutions by their own citizens. An unprecedented process, not just in modern Arab history. In the last 10,000 years of settled communal living in the Arab world, we have the oldest history since the Natufian Neolithic period, 8000 BC. We have the oldest history in the world of communities that have lived in the same place and generation after generation after generation. They pass on their memories, their values, and their humanity to the next generation. Never in these 10,000 years have the people of these societies, whether they're villages or towns or whatever, never have they written their own constitutions. And when there were constitutions written in every Arab country, they were written by a few people in the elite, linked to the ruling family, put in place by foreign powers, kept in place by their military and security services, and mostly copying French and Belgian constitutions that meant absolutely nothing in a tribal Islamic Arab context of the Arab world. So all of the constitutions that were written in the Arab world had very little relevance and very little significance. And that's why we've had these rebellions now taking place for 2 almost 3 years. But the constitutions that are written by their own citizens, the process has started. And that is probably the single highest affirmation of the first the two things I mentioned, which is the birth of citizens in the public political sphere. And the constitutions that they will create will result in the next thing that I think is new, which is the beginnings of legitimacy of public authority and the institutions of power and governance. Legitimacy is the key word. We've had institutions of governance and power for 10,000 years. But they rarely had legitimacy in the eyes of their own citizens. And that process is starting to happen very, very slowly. The seventh thing that I think we can identify, which is really important and still happening, democratically elected Islamist Muslim brothers and others were given the opportunity to rule, and they mostly failed, and they are being thrown out of office. Mostly in a democratic way, but not always in a democratic way. The brief period of the last year and a half, in Tunisia and Egypt, I think is profoundly important because it allowed democratically elected Islamists to rule and to prove that they were actually buffoons in the business of governance. They had no idea what they were doing. They were not just mediocre, they were totally incompetent. And in Egypt in particular, they acted with a greed and a predatory recklessness that caused the millions of people to rise up against them and then the army to move against them. We can argue whether that was the right thing to do. I think the army should not have moved so quickly. But the important thing is not what the army did. The important thing is you had this Tamarrud movement, which was a rebirth of that spirit of citizen activism in the public sphere, where citizens were demanding that they be treated as citizens by their government. And the Islamists have been they won the right to govern legitimately, democratically, and they screwed it up royally. They had no idea what they were doing, and they were thrown out by the activism of their own people. And then the last thing that all of these things, if you put them together, and I believe that these 7 points I mentioned are all significant new things that will last, are not just a flash in the pan. They will continue to evolve, but together they, I think, represent the first small stirrings of genuine Arab self-determination. The first small stirrings of real Arab self-determination, where citizens, Arab people, can sit together and try to define their values, create their governance systems, shape their constitutions, affirm their national principles of authority and accountability, and do all the things that you have to do to be self-determinant. And if you look at what this means, it basically means that the three previous orders that defined the Arab world for the last 100 years of the modern period, the post-World War I order of the British, French, Italian created states of the region, that order is starting to collapse because the actual states, these countries, are in many cases showing their fragility as countries. Sudan 2 years ago broke up. Southern Sudan seceded peacefully and democratically. That was a profoundly important moment because it meant that the post-World War I order was not inviolable, that in fact you could break it. When Saddam Hussein tried to break it and occupied Kuwait, the world said, sorry, this order is untouchable. And the armies attacked, and Kuwait was liberated, which it should have been. And the post-World War I order stayed. That post-World War I order has now been shattered by its own people, first in Sudan, and now by the people in different countries trying to create new mechanisms of not just governance and authority, but national configuration. And I would not be surprised to see other Arab countries perhaps evolving in their geographical configuration. The second order that's being broken is the post-World War II order, which coincides with the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Cold War, and the state-building process that we've seen, which was very successful in many Arab countries in providing housing, schooling, and education, healthcare, jobs, but started to collapse in the 1980s when governments simply could not keep up with population growth. And that led to the third order, which is the post-1970 oil-fueled security state Arab order. And the post-1970s oil-fueled security state system was one in which the former nationalist development state in the Arab world was replaced by the consumer security state, where the military ruled, and people like Gaddafi and Hafiz al-Assad and Saddam Hussein and others in the period in the early 70s, they came into power and stayed for 30, 40 years, some of them. And they basically told their people, you have rights as consumers. You don't have any other rights. You can buy as many cell phones and build as many malls as you want, buy and sell property, make money, but you have no rights as citizens. And the security services ran everything. That order is starting to collapse, and it has started to collapse because its own people have started to bring it down. So I think these are new elements, and I believe that they are probably lasting elements, but we'll see. And I believe they're lasting because they're not mechanical constructs or physical achievements. They're affirmations of what's deep inside people's soul and their spirit and their mind and their heart. It is what they are all about as citizens, as human beings, as Arabs, as Muslims, as Christians, few Jews in the Arab world, not many left, but as people who are from that region and want to live in that region with full dignity and rights. And they are, for the first time, bringing those sentiments out into the public sphere to change the political orders. The second question is what persists? I think we can see a few things that have not changed significantly. The most significant is the role of the armed forces and old political orders, old political actors. In Egypt, you see this very clearly, in Yemen, in other places. The old order won't go away, doesn't want to accept all these new things, doesn't want self-determinant citizens, wants compliant, quiescent citizens, it wants consumers, doesn't want citizens. So the armed forces, the old guard, the old parties, National Democratic Party in Egypt and others, often in cahoots with foreign money from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from Kuwait, from the US, from Europe, China, Russia, all over the world, people are pouring money and arms and other things, political support, to try to keep as much of the old order in place as they can. And this is the big battle that's still being fought. So that's why I said what we're seeing is the early stirrings of self-determination. It may be snuffed out. There's no guarantee that any of these countries are going to make the transition. They might all end up like Kazakhstan after the Russian, the Soviet collapse, and we end up with a neo-police state or neo-security state. The second thing that is not changing is the very powerful role of subnational identities: religion, ethnicity, tribe, family, regional identities, sectarian identities. You look at Libya, you look at Yemen, you see very powerful identities of tribe and sect, and in other countries you see the religious groupings and the ethnic groupings in places like Bahrain and Syria. These are the most powerful identities that people have. They never let go of these identities. They were always there. But they've now come out much more forcefully. And they will not go away until they can be replaced by the only thing that can replace them, which is citizenship under a democratic, pluralistic rule of law system guaranteed by constitutional rights written by the citizens. If that happens, then people don't have to assert their religious or their tribal or their ethnic identity. They can be citizens of this country and have full citizenship rights with everybody else. Until that happens, this is what we are seeing, the continued subnational identities that are being activated as fierce political instruments and sometimes militarized. So what we're seeing is that these states, these countries, the handiwork of retreating French and British colonial officers, these countries are still thin. And they're still thin because they were never validated by their own people. And hopefully the self-determination process, if it succeeds, will bring validation to the countries, and it may change the shape of some of these countries. You probably all saw that map in the New York Times Sunday edition last week, which created quite a stir. Well, it wasn't the map in the New York Times that I think was dramatic of how this region could break up. What's dramatic is the map we've had since 1920 until today. This kind of nutty map of the Arab countries, almost all of which would never have come into being as countries of that shape. A Kuwait, a Jordan, an Iraq, a Libya, these countries would never have been born naturally as countries. And so that's the scary map, is the map that we've lived for the last 4 generations. And that's why the Sudanese started the process of redrawing these maps. A third thing that we still see and persists is a great amount of meddling by external powers in evolving conditions in the region. You look at Syria, which is the most dramatic example. Syria, in my view, is the greatest proxy war of all time. All time. Never have we had a proxy war in which so many local, regional, and global actors have fought each other viciously in what they see, all of them see as existential life or death battles. And the ferocity, the brutality, the barbarism that you're seeing at the fighting level and at the communal level and at the political level, when people veto resolutions for safe access for humanitarian passage, I mean, that's barbarism, it's political barbarism. And that barbarism is explained by the fact that every one of the people in Syria fighting and the hundreds of external supporters see this as a life or death battle. And if they lose, they're gone. They don't see this as a South Africa-like situation where you might reach a political compromise and then you change the system and everybody lives happily together. They see this as 2 gladiators in a pit. One of them will die, one of them will live. And they will fight to the death to be the ones who live. But so these external forces in the region, it's mostly Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, the Emirates, people around the region who are Turkey, and globally you're getting the Americans, the French, the Russians, and then many other international groups, as well as the new trend of these Islamist fighters from Chechnya, from Pakistan and stuff, going into Syria. So there's huge external meddling that has made Syria and Iraq today, and Lebanon, I would say, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq now must be seen as a single unit, which is the world's greatest driver of Salafist terrorism, training, mobilization, and export of these radical fighters and terrorists. Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon now form this one unit, which is going to be very difficult to change, but it will ultimately be changed because these groups, these Salafist Al-Qaeda type groups, have no real anchorage in these societies. They only flourish in situations of chaos. So it's no accident that these groups flourished in Afghanistan, a little bit in Pakistan, and then in Somalia, and then in southern Yemen, and now in Syria, in situations where there is no governance, there is no rule, there is no citizenship. People have no rights, there's chaos, and they flourish briefly. And they will disappear eventually. But for the moment, they're there, and they are part of the international intervention in the region. The fourth thing that still persists is a nagging legacy of political violence. Bombings, street fighting, and by everybody, by governments, by the armed forces, by opposition groups, by freelance terrorists, by everybody. So there are really strong problems with the persistence of these old forces. The third question, what remains to achieve? Because I want to finish in 5 minutes so we have more time for Q&A. What remains to achieve? Well, the first thing that still remains to be achieved is the validity, the legitimacy, the configuration of statehood. The most fundamental unit of modern life is the state. So the validity, the legitimacy, and the configuration, the shape of these countries needs to be achieved. And that's going to take some time. It'll happen when the second major thing that remains to be done is the constitutional accords are finalized, new constitutions are created that reflect a consensus on national values and the institutions of governance. The Tunisians are the closest to doing this. The Egyptians are close behind. Yemen, Libya may follow soon, we'll see. And then other countries like Jordan, Morocco, and they may evolve through a reform process of their existing systems. We don't know, we'll see what happens. But the constitutional accords are the critical element now in this movement forward. Because once citizens feel that real constitutions that they drafted will protect them, they will then behave like citizens, and they'll stop taking up guns or fighting in the streets or turning to their religion or to their ethnicity or whatever to protect them. The third thing that still has to be sorted out is what is the real balance between civil and military authority. There's a lot of going back and forth in Egypt, you see it particularly. The role of the armed forces in national governance. People trust the armed forces. They want them to be involved in transition processes, but they don't want these transition processes to go on year after year after year. And when it first happened in 2011-12, there was great satisfaction in Egypt that the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, SCAF, was in charge of the transition to a democratic system. But there was also intense pressure on the SCAF to get this done by June 2012. I was there several times then, and there was both people were relieved that the army was overseeing this transition, but they wanted the army out by June 2012, and that's what happened. And now the army's back, and many people are happy, but I think the majority of Egyptians who went out onto the streets repeatedly to challenge Mubarak, to challenge the SCAF, to challenge the Muslim Brothers, to challenge Ahmed Shafiq and the old order, to challenge everybody who tried to dominate the system, those tens of millions of Egyptians who manifested their sentiments on the street, they're still there. And we need to hear from them and find out what they really want and what they really feel needs to be, what needs to be done. And we really don't know in Egypt what is the majority view in the population about the civilian-military balance of power. And this is something that can only come through the constitution writing process. And the fourth thing that remains to be achieved is to have a clear consensus in every country, which will be different, on the balance between religiosity and secularism. We don't know what is the real sentiment that shapes the majority of people in Tunis and Egypt. But what we do know is there's an extraordinary debate going on. If you follow the debate in Tunis and Egypt on the constitutional writing process in the committees and in some of the public discussions and in the media, it's spellbinding, I think. It's something quite extraordinary, where people are sitting there talking about how do you define who is a Tunisian, what is an Arab, what about non-Arab Tunisians, what about non-Muslim Egyptians. what is the role? How do you reconcile Sharia with non-Muslim Egyptians? How do you reconcile the role of the armed forces with citizen legitimacy? These are, seminal core issues of what it means to be a country that is legitimate in the eyes of its own people, and a governance system that serves the people well. These are fundamental big sticker items that they're trying to reconcile right now as we talk in these meetings. In Yemen and Libya, the big debate is the regional portion of power. Yemen has a committee working on this, and the latest proposal is to have a kind of federal system with 4 major parts of Yemen joined at the center in a kind of federal government, but power decentralized in 4 areas. The Southerners wanted only 2 areas, the North and the South, but they compromised on the 4. In Libya, the same thing. The 3 different major groups, parts of the country in Libya and the demographic populations, there may be 3 large confederal units in Libya. Syria, Iraq, certainly Iraq is already split up into different areas. So how these elements of nationhood are defined by their own people in a manner that provides both stability of the state and a relative efficiency of government operations, this is what they're trying to actually decide right now. So the role of religion, the role of the army, the role of men and women, the role of the media, it's a spellbinding process in which people are looking at all the different aspects of what it means to have a credible constitution and a stable and satisfying state. And lastly, the consequences and expectations. I mean, it's really hard to say anything other than there's going to be a lot of different outcomes in many different countries. We've seen now we're going to have terrible wars like in Syria. We'll have countries that may fall apart and then be put back together in different configurations. There may be a redrawing of borders and maps. There may be countries that simply fatigue and end up in a stalemate and say, okay, let's just kind of keep things quiet and we'll figure out the governance stuff later on. And this is what the United States did in 1779. They said, well, forget about black people, forget about women's rights. We'll deal with those in the 19th and the 20th and 21st centuries, but let's for now just deal with state rights and federal rights. And you leave the big sticker items till later, which is what the United States did. And this is an option that many people in the Arab world, I think, will try to address, but I don't think it'll fly, because what we're seeing, as I said in the beginning, is this extraordinary, unprecedented process by which these people, these nutty people in the Arab world, are trying to achieve all of their national goals simultaneously, which nobody in history has ever done. I hope we achieve it, but I think it's very difficult. So I think what we're likely to see is in some countries people saying, okay, let's leave the decentralization stuff we'll set up a commission and they'll decide on this in the coming years, but let's agree on our borders, let's agree on the role of the army and the role of religion and stuff like that. So there's going to be a wide variety of different conditions in these different countries. The issue that I think we should keep looking for, one of the consequences and one of the expectations that I think is very important is to ask, where are those tens of millions of people who went out into the streets several times in the last 2.5, 3 years, who fought the old regimes, who fought the armed forces, who fought the Islamists, who fought the old guard? Where is that spirit of citizen sovereignty, of revolutionary fervor, or whatever you want to call it, of democratic self-assertion? Where is that spirit in the tens of millions of these people in all of these countries? And in Syria, the millions who have been fighting for 2.5 years and dying, but they continue to fight. So we don't know how strong is the willingness of individual men and women inside in their hearts to keep fighting, to keep struggling under difficult conditions. At some point, people have to feed their children and get money to buy heating oil in winter. We have refugee flows now that are in the millions out of Syria and other places. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about the intensity and the durability of these revolutionary spirit that that people have. But I think we can say for now simply that there are these new elements that seem to be real, that are continuing. We can see the beginnings of processes of constitutionalism and self-determination, but there's a significant pushback from the counter-revolutionary forces and the regressive forces in the Arab world from the Gulf and from other places and from overseas. We will see in the next probably year and a half, 2 years, we should see more clearly how these different situations will evolve. And my guess is we'll see the first breakthrough in Tunisia to have a really credible, democratic, constitutional, pluralistic, republican, accountable, and equity law-based state, an Arab state, the first one of its kind ever. And I think it'll spark the same kind of enthusiasm around the region as we saw when Hamad Bouazizi set himself on fire and several 100 million Arabs immediately tuned in because they saw what he did, they understood how he felt, and they shared his sentiment. And I think when Tunis makes that first breakthrough to democratic statehood, I think you're going to find a similar spillover effect where people will push much harder in Arab countries to achieve something similar. But some Arab countries won't make it. Some of them will collapse. Some of them will go back to police states. We'll leave that for the future. Thank you very much.